thank you, Franziska, for being with us. I sit in Bloomington, you sit in Frankfurt. Thanks to the miracle of Zoom, here we are. If I look outside my window, I see snow. I hope things are better where you are. Anyway, welcome to everyone who's tuned in today. Günther already announced the theme of Franziska's talk. It's certainly pertinent. One of the things we've learned over the years is that developments within universities don't stay only within university walls, but go out into the mainstream of society. And one of the surprising, maybe even paradoxical developments on campuses is the presence of anti-Semitism within certain movements considered generally progressive. I'm sure that our speaker today will talk about that, among other things as well. Those of you who have tuned into the Beiner series that we organize know that we've featured talks by some of the most accomplished scholars of anti-Semitism of this generation. We're also keenly interested in featuring talks by younger and upcoming scholars, and our speaker today is just such a person. Franziska Haug is at Goethe-University in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. She's speaking to us, in fact, today from there. She's doing a Ph.D. in the Institute for German Literature. She's also a research assistant in that department. In the past, she served as a research assistant at NYU in New York City as well, and a bright career awaits her, I'm sure. Her research interests these days focus her on Marxism and materialism, women and gender studies, pop culture and aesthetics, critical theory, and anti-Semitism. And it's on this latter aspect, anti-Semitism, that she's going to be speaking to us. Franziska, it's my pleasure now to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Alvin and dear Günther, for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak here in this lecture series with so many bright and interesting researchers. And before I start, I'm gonna share my screen so that you all can see presentation. Okay, thank you. I think it works. Yeah, just a brief note. I already told it, Alvin and Günther. My engagement with anti-Semitism has emerged from my political practice more than from academia, and from the experience that anti-Semitism in the left and queer scene, in my case in Germany, is often a blank space, and or the engagement with Israel and kind of obsessive phantasma. This means that my lecture today is not only spoken from an academic perspective, but also draws on experiences in the German left and queer scene. Okay. For over 20 years, an increased trend of Israel-related anti-Semitism has been observed within academia and political activism, especially in the United States, UK, and Europe. This particularly affects gender and queer studies, as well as post-colonial and intersectional theories. Ressentiment against Israel or relativization of the Shoah, as well as traditional anti-Semitic thought patterns, have found a new home in some theories of famous gender studies professors. Discourses around so-called pinkwashing, homo-nationalism, the classification of Israel as a colonial, racist, apartheid state find a practical counterpart in a large part of queer leftist movements. Thus, US, American, but internationally widespread groups and institutions like Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, Queers for Palestine, Pinkwashing Israel, All Cause for Sexual and Gender Diversity in Palestinian Society, and many more, call for the de facto extermination of the Jewish state under the claim, and that maybe you hear that on some demonstrations, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is accompanied by the invisibilization of queer Jews and queer Israelis. This development of the last 10 or 20 years is surprising to me in relation to gender and queer studies, because the struggle against and the critique of anti-Semitism has many theoretical overlaps with the concerns of queer feminism. Queer studies developed theories in the 1990s that were directed not only against the patriarchal, heteronormative social structure, but above all, against the pressure of the subject for total identification with the same. Thus, in their beginnings, with maybe Judith Butler, Donna Haraway, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, among others, they were a firmly anti-identitarian project. This queer anti-identitarian project defended against the quote Adorno identity compulsion. In German, it's Identitätszwang, like the compulsion to have like a homogeneous identity. And this prevailing in capitalism. The unclean, the unnatural, the inappropriate, the polymorph, perverted, homeless, and non-identical are queer terms. That means I start from a definition of queer that is directed precisely against the kind of domination that is grounded in notions of identity of domination. Especially in relation to the regulation of the gendered body as biopolitical power principle of capitalism, critique of anti-Semitism and progressive queer feminism have overlaps that could be made fruitful for a common emancipatory concern. One example of common ground is the specifically biopolitical sexism against Jews, which, especially in the Nazi era in Germany, attempted to exclude them from the ideology of the German body and gender norm on the basis of gender and physical attributes in order to establish, in contrast, an identitarian norm of the national community, the so-called German Volksgemeinschaft. Thus, and these stereotypes continue to this day, Jewish men were considered too small, too effeminate, unmanly, and Jewish women too permissive or promiscuous. Monty Ott, a German researcher, in his research on the entanglement of LGBTQI Jews, homophobia, and anti-Semitism, speaks of this Jewish subject, which I mentioned, as an antitype in this context. And Monty Ott, by the way, is one of the founders of Keshet, an association that is very interesting in this context and stands for the queer Jewish LGBTQI community in Germany. Thus, Jewishness does not merge into the binary logic of dominant identity types. Rather, it blocks the identitarian causal chain from the one pure, genuine origin of to the real-life gender identity. This variety of ideological critique of the one biological or ethnic or similar origin is in turn a genuinely queer one. As Donna Haraway, a queer writer, puts it out, the queer cyborg figure is, quote, not on the basis of original innocence, but on the basis of seizing the tools to mark the world that mark them as other. The tools are often stories, retold stories, versions that reverse and displace in the hierarchical dualism of naturalized identities, and retelling origin stories. Cyborg authors subvert the central myth of origin of Western culture. The cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Quote end. These few examples should now be enough here to show that from a theoretical perspective of early queer feminism, there is, for me, no logical connection of queer and anti-Semitism. That means there was no specific feminist anti-Semitism, as maybe the author Liliana Radonjic recently formulated it. However, both the academic development in queer and gender studies, as well as the political practice of queer feminist left-wing movements, clearly speak against the similarities I pointed out. Therefore, in the following, I will try to find answers to the question why, of all things, in what is considered a progressive field, such Israel-related anti-Semitism could emerge as a new general fixed point of political and academic collectivization. To this end, I will pursue two observations that represent key movements in relation to these questions. First, shifts have emerged in both academic and political practice that seek to establish and generalize anti-Zionism and Israel-related anti-Semitism as an international code for the struggle against oppression. In this first part, I will make a rather descriptive inventory based on exemplary cases. Secondly, and this is my more fundamental thesis maybe, the theoretical focus on the particular, specific, individual, in intersectional, postcolonial, and identity logical queer theories, as well as the socio-economic shift to a neoliberal society of singularities, as the German sociologist Andreas Reckwitz calls it, has resulted in a loss of the general and long-standing in universal points of reference, such as maybe the international solidarity of all women or workers beyond origin, skin color. A primary thesis would thus be that queer subjects counter the disintegration or fragmentation of their identities and collectives into particularism by searching for a collective point of reference. Anti-Zionism, Israel-related anti-Semitism can fulfill this function of the collective forming universal. In the agreement of anti-Semitic thought patterns, those who seem to be separated from each other in and by their own identity logical theories and practices due to different skin colors, origins, sexualities, gender identities, etc., experience themselves as a collective. In this second part, I will use Theodor Adorno's and Andreas Reckwitz to cast a social theoretical materialist perspective on the phenomena described. To the first point, the rise of Israel-related anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in queer theory and movement has to do, among other things, with fundamental shifts in the definition power in the anti-Semitism debate. In discourses around, for example, in what you may call the second historians' controversy, post-colonial apartheid debates, or the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which seeks to replace the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, there have been arguments about the status of the singularity of the Shoah and, subsequently, about the question of what giving up this singularity would mean for political activism. These discourses very often enter into a connection with those political struggles that are being waged in the US, UK, and Europe in the name of the Palestinian and queer liberation struggle. All the mentioned queer movements on the anti-Israel spectrum, of which I have already given a few examples, make two claims in this regard. First, they claim that Israel, and here they rarely differentiate in government and parties, state, country, population. Most of the time, it's just Israel as the word, is by far the most colonialist, racist, imperialist, homophobic, and capitalist state in the world. Therefore, and this is the second claim, Israel would have to be destroyed for queer Palestinians to be free. For example, the US campaign to end Israeli occupations, well, that's the name from this campaign, understands, I quote, Palestine as a queer struggle, quote end. And then they quote Guy Tilal from All Queers, the anti-Zionist organization I already mentioned, quote, "You cannot have queer liberation while apartheid, patriarchy, capitalism, and other oppressions exist. It's important to target the connection of these oppressive forces," quote end. Instead of first understanding the oppressive mechanism mentioned in each case for themselves and combating, the following text of this campaign says that the connections of these oppressive forces, which they mention, is Israel. And then they're hoping for the examination of Israel as the solution to all the problems mentioned. So the solution would be if Israel isn't existing anymore, so the capitalism is going away and patriarchy ends. That the anti-Zionism of the academic and left milieu, as exemplified here, is anti-Semitically colored, functions anti-Semitically, or is also functionalized, is negated here and every other place. And I have not been able to find arguments that disprove Jean Amery's following argument. For Jean Amery, there is no anti-Zionism. He calls it, quote, respectable anti-Semitism. And I translated it in German, it's ehrbarer Antisemitismus, that does not or cannot also function anti-Semitically. Quote, "The left must be more honest. There's no respectable anti-Semitism. Israel's existence is indispensable for all Jews, wherever they may live." Quote end. For years, multiple of open letters, articles, and boycott actions have been directed against Israel's existence worldwide. Among the supporters, for example, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel, or the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, or in Germany, the initiative GG53 from the culture perspective, there are striking many feminists and queer academic and cultural workers. Also, the other way around, numerous queer and feminist movements also feature self-described anti-Zionists, such as Linda Zazur, Lana Siri, Laurie Penny, Kypra Gümüşay, Naomi Klein, Sarah Schulman, Angela Davis, Judith Butler, and many more. A prominent example of how anti-Semitism and queer have been attempted to be combined theoretically is Jasbir Puar, a US gender studies professor at Rutgers University, New Jersey. She coined the term pinkwashing Israel, first used by US-based Sarah Schulman, which conceives of its liberal LGBTQI policies as a cover-up tactic. I quote Puar, "Israel's gay propaganda war one of the most remarkable features of the Brand Israel campaign is the marketing of a modern Israel as a gay-friendly Israel. This pinkwashing, as it is now commonly termed in activist circles, has currency beyond Israelis gay groups. Within global gay and lesbian organization circuits, to be gay-friendly is to be modern, cosmopolitan, developed, first world, global north, and most significantly democratic. Quote end. Israel is kind of understood here in the rhetoric of finance. Universal values of recognition of LGBTQIs served only for marketing and currency to conspiratorially disguise otherwise criminal policies. It is not by chance that this terminology resembles the anti-Semitic contract of the calculating interest, the Jew, versus here then the German Protestantic worker, put forward, for example, by the German philosopher Heidegger, among others. For Puar, Israel's right to exist is nothing more than the result of Jewish machinations. In German, Machenschaften, that's the term she's using. This shows the connection between an actually emancipatory movement like queer, is it or could be, its tragedies, pinkwashing here, the cover-up tactic, and the traditional rhetoric of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And maybe you'll find more details on the history of the term pinkwashing in Corinne Blackmer's book. Thanks, Günther, for the recommendation. The name of the book is Queering Anti-Zionism, Academic Freedom, LGBTQ Intellectuals and Israel-Palestine Campus Activism. It's fresh from September this year. So Puar's concept of queer feminism is also otherwise questionable, as she relates Islamistic attacks to a resistance queer body practice. She calls it queer jihad. Moreover, in her book, The Right to Maim, which is, quote, dedicated to the fortitude of the Palestinian people, the imminent liberation of Palestine, quote end, she uses anti-Semitic vocabulary such as the quote ethnic cleansing, and suggests that prevalence of homophobia and transphobia among Palestinian and Muslims is a discourse invented by Israel. Another example is the feminist and BDS supporter Linda Sarsour, who said, quote, nothing is creepier than Zionism. She is tweeting in favor of Palestine's armed struggle against Israel, making Holocaust comparisons. For example, she said that racism in the US is a Holocaust against Black people. In a 2017 speech, she claimed there were no pro-Israel or Zionist feminist groups fighting racism against Blacks. When Israeli Jews participated in the New York March for Radical Justice in October 2017, they were told to take down their signs and leave the demonstration by Linda Sarsour, among others, saying she was afraid and that Muslim activists might feel uncomfortable. When women rights activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali pointed out that Linda Sarsour was advocating for worldwide Sharia, the entirety of Islamic law, Sarsour reacted in a verbally violent manner. One should, quote, take away the vagina from Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Linda Sarsour is or was for a long time, among others, the initiator of the International Women's March Washington, the same called on its website for domination and solidarity with the Islamic Relief Fund. The executive director of the Islamic Relief Fund in the US is Khalid Lamada, and a vowed supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, some of the oldest existing Islamist men's organizations. Also part of Women's March Washington is the feminist Carmen Perez, who called Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan an, quote, inspiring individual. Equally active in a Women's March Washington was Tamika Mallory, who publicly congratulates and praises Farrakhan for his commitment. And Louis Farrakhan called Adolf Hitler a, quote, great man, states that Jews were not only satanic, but also responsible for the September 11 attacks. At his 2015 Survivors Day speech, he spoke out against the suspension of the homophobic sodomy law in Central America. According to him, homosexuality is forbidden in the Quran. Homosexuals would go, as his view rightly, quote, to hell. Yes, and this all is an absolute contradiction, just like the silence of the queer anti-Zionists about the violence of Hamas in some areas in Palestine against queer people. Among feminists and gender studies researchers, Pua and Zazua are thus no exception. Even queer scholars Amy Villajero and Jordi Rosenberg, both professors, Villajero at Cornell and Jordi Rosenberg at the University of Massachusetts, I can't say this word, in their book, Queer Studies and the Crisis of Capitalism, lists in their introduction as examples of the most important social movements of the entire 2000 in the struggle against racist and sexist oppression worldwide, exclusively examples characterized by Israel-related anti-Semitism. I quote their examples: queers undermining Israeli apartheid, queers undermining Israeli terrorism, all cause Palestine, anti-Zionist networks, queer BDS groups, and many more. Apart from the fact that one could criticize this conclusion politically, it is academically unfair to subsume the feminist, queer, and left movements of the last 20 years exclusively under the perspective of anti-Israel activism. From a queer feminist perspective, one would have to list the movement for the right to body empowerment, for abortion, maybe against violence against women, the Me Too movement as well, if one, so I think, wants to represent the most important movements of the last 20 years. While gender and queer studies were originally characterized by the deconstruction of normative generalization movements, the treatment of anti-Semitism is now paradoxical in relation to this movement. Israel is singularized. Single out is a term by Georg Hafner and Esther Shapira. I use this term from them, single out Israel. And in anti-Zionism, a new, but also, as I will show in a moment with Andreas Reckwitz, fails general or universal statehood, and whose particularity is veiled. So now I come to my second part. Based on this cursory inventory of examples from the current debates in queer studies, I would now like to attempt to sketch a social theoretical explanation for these apparent contradictions. In doing so, I follow Andreas Reckwitz in his analysis. Reckwitz is a German sociologist. I follow Andreas Reckwitz in his analysis that in late modern capitalism, quote, social structural change is taking place, which consists in the fact that the social logic of the general is losing its predominance to the social logic of the particular, quote end. According to Reckwitz, this is accompanied by a culturalization of the social and a politics of representation oriented towards recognition of the particular. Both can be observed par excellence in queer feminist discourses. Processes of essentialization often go hand in hand with queer theories based on identity logic. For example, in discourses about critique of cultural appropriation and intersectionality conceived as a hierarchical model of effectiveness, or in discourses about privileges. In an as logic, in this logic, the individual is now not placed in the foreground in its mention with society, but as particular. But even what the subjects experience as special or singular is, in the sense of Karl Marx commodity fetish I would use here, for Andreas Reckwitz, quote, socially fabricated through and through. This real paradox, quote, this was quote Reckwitz, of late modern capitalism, that the social revolves precisely around singularities, is paradigmatically shown in current queer feminism. From my point of view, queer feminism is no longer succeeds in what it once stood for, to decode as particular precisely that which shows itself as general or universal. The reason for this inability lies, above all, in the fact that identitarian queer theories no longer think of mediation with material relations or with, according to Theodor W. Adorno, class society. I translated this quote Adorno, race is not, as the Völkischen, the nationalists in German, would have it, directly the natural particular. Rather, it is the reduction of the natural to mere violence, the hidden particularity, which in capitalism is precisely the general. Race today is the self-assertion of bourgeois individualism integrated in the barbaric collective. The persecution of the Jews, like persecution in general, cannot be separated from class society. Quote end. A critique of racism or anti-Semitism that foregrounds the particular in terms of identity logic without thinking of its mediation with the general must fail in terms of its emancipatory claims. For the point of the fetish character of the commodity, this was the Marx quote, is precisely that the specific social relation of the capitalist mode of production appears as the social natural property of things. Characteristics or properties that belong to people or things merely by their position and function within the valorization of value appear as supra-historical, therefore as natural properties of things. So any talk of properties that serve as the output of identity construction inverts the social relation. This inversion is, with Marx speaking, itself objective thought form, in which consciousness in capitalism determines itself and content. Capitalism, then, is always also the, according to Adorno, eminent production of consciousness, by establishing a social relationship of domination on supposedly inescapable characteristics of individuals. A queer and materialist critique of ideology, on the other hand, would have to criticize precisely these fabrications of the general universal constituted by hidden particularities. It would then be an anti-essentialistic theory that removes race, class, and gender from their supposed naturalness and exposes that such characteristics are socially produced. In this context, it is not surprising that anti-Semitism either does not quite fit into the intersectional theory that queer feminism often refers to, or that it appears as a variety of racism. And I saw that in this webinar series, Karin Stöckner also already talked about the intersectionality and maybe the problems about anti-Semitism as a lack or missing point there. For anti-Semitism cannot be countered precisely with a valorization or representation of a supposedly homogeneous Jewish identity, identical to itself, because the ideology of anti-Semitism is composed of the ambivalences of supposedly binary homogeneous categories. In the misrecognition of anti-Semitism, the structure of the overall social context of oppression is also misrecognized. For by rejecting the universal, general, for example, the we of the woman, which is kind of lost in the queer movements right now. It's more a term from the second women's movement, I guess, or the we of the workers. So by rejecting the universal general, like this we, and focusing on the particular, for example, my very special particular identity, my particular gender, and so on, the view is also obscured for that general which affects everyone, albeit in different ways. The universal negativity of bad circumstances in capitalism. Queer feminism is the best example of this fundamental structural change from the logic of the general to the logic of the particular, as Andreas Reckwitz describes it. Started as an emancipatory project whose social and political achievements emerged not least from collective struggles, for example, the Stonewall riots in New York, the ACT UP movement, etc. The loss of the general has a particularly strong effect when, due to the respective particularities, no positive general universal can be found to form a collective. This loss of general, summarizing here Marx, Adorno, and Reckwitz, comes one hand from the described general cultural and social change, and on the other hand from the fact that in the identitarian queer feminism it is misjudged that the particular shows itself in bourgeois capitalist society precisely as the general. Every queer theory that fails to recognize its own conditions of production and raises the particular to the universal valid general formally proceeds in a similar way to the ruling ideology, which has been striving to abolish. By failing to recognize the actual cause of social suffering, so in my view, the capitalist mode of production, maybe, a void opens up not only in the lack of positive general for queer collectivities, but also in the definition of the enemy. For if neither a positive general, maybe the we of the woman, nor a shared negative general, which could be the capitalist mode of production, because it's worldwide general, exists, collective political practice becomes almost impossible. In the demonization and delegitimization of Israel, the queer community now seems to have found a new universal point of reference. They posit a singular problem as a universal, and thus to exactly what the structure of capitalist that produces their consciousness does. They project. Israel-related anti-Semitism is thus thereby given the function of constituting a new general. This, however, is a false general because its collective movement is composed of the affirmation of neoliberal, identity-logically segregated particularities. For example, in the form of, I quote Adorno, the reduction of the natural to mere violence, the hidden particularity, quote end. Thus, this collectivity of those queer communities remains particularized and stands in opposition to an emancipatory politics of the generality that aims at the abolition of the neoliberal logic of isolation. So a paradoxical shift has emerged. While it was queer, post-colonial, and anti-racist theories that criticized the formerly universal for its false generalizations of actually particular positions. We all know the masculine white man was used as human and in general. It is now precisely that the statute a new but equally false general at the expense of Jews. What remains paradoxical for me then is why this anti-Semitic identity logic was able to spread precisely in queer feminism. Insofar as queer feminism is identity ideological in the way I have described, its new home, Israel-related anti-Semitism, is not a paradox. Insofar it is due to the non-observance of capitalist mechanisms. So, in this sense, I would like to end with two thoughts. First, with a plea to refer back to anti-identitarian queer theory, to link it to materialist analysis, and to think it together with the critique of anti-Semitism. This was the point where I started. And second, for a critique of ideology that exposes false projections, because the elimination of Israel will not end capitalism and patriarchy. Thank you very much for your attention.